All right, I've tried to condense this down into like the most synopsis ever. So I'll try. How about I try and do that? And if someone else wants to give one after I fail to do that, then that's cool.
You want me to put the timer on you, Wes?
All right. Yeah, but maybe that would be a good. And then just stop listening after my
You're preempting our jokes, dude.
Rousseau is worried about the origins of inequality in society and wealth and social status and so on. And he's thinking of things in terms of natural right and states of nature. And specifically, we talked about Hobbes before, where the idea is that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, and it's basically the strong rule the weak. And then societies come about as a way to remedy this. Well, Rousseau is going to turn that on its head and say that, in fact, the state of nature, meaning human beings before they've been socialized, or what he calls savages.
Like the people of the Caribbean, as he often refers to.
Yes.
Racist bastard.
Oh, my God.
He's going to say that they're happy and healthy and, in fact, doing very well until the advent of social relations. And that's where, once society comes about, once civilization comes about, that's where we start to get inequality and vices and everything else that we lament. Where does society come from? In the second part of the essay, he sort of try and trace how we get from this state of nature and happiness to the evil civilization as we know it. I think the basic way to describe all of that is that it comes about with our reflectiveness and self-awareness, which, while it leads to all our improvements and advancements in technology, also leads to this kind of sense of pride and basically the awareness of relative strength and weakness. So it's one thing to have natural abilities in the state of nature. It's another to be aware of them and then to become aware that others are aware of them and that you can sort of use them for mutual assistance or that others may be harmful to you. And that concept of mutual assistance leads to social structures and to property and to tighter social relations between people, familial relations, and to the valuation of public esteem and recognition, circles around caterpillars, all that stuff. And then to taking offense at disrespect. So once you start to value the recognition of others, then you can take offense when that recognition isn't provided. And then on the other side of things, you get division of labor and a sort of amplification of the inequality in natural abilities, which don't mean that much in a state of nature, but they mean a lot when there's a division of labor because some people gain a lot more by doing the same work, and so you get inequalities in wealth. And then the final step is, because of all those divisions as they rise up socially, there's a sort of zero-sum game going on between the more powerful and the less powerful. The rich are worried about, being overthrown by revolution, and the weak are kind of miserable. So the rich sort of invent this ideology, which essentially enslaves everyone, which is that we'll come up with a concept of law and justice, which will protect everyone, and that's where we'll put the power so that no particular person or class has it. But for Rousseau, of course, that just institutionalizes the whole scheme, which subjects everyone to the slavery of society. So, yeah,
that's pretty good. He took Hobbes's picture of people in the state of nature having a terrible time, and they make this compact. He actually uses that. He still has a compact in there. He still acknowledges the nasty state that's pre-full-scale civilization, but he says that that's much later. He traced a few steps before that. He just says Hobbes's picture is not complicated enough.
His state of nature already assumes social relations, already assumes a socialized being, right?
Yeah, that's his criticism of all philosophers to this point who've talked about the state of nature have transferred their own ideas of society onto their conceptions of what the state of nature is and then sort of snuck them in and brought them back. Because he doesn't fundamentally disagree with Hobbes that the individual's sense of self-preservation or desire for self-preservation is kind of the one constant. He just thinks that the environment in which the individual is trying to self-preserve is very, very different. And that people in general are more or less indifferent to others insofar as they don't intrude upon them, as opposed to being constantly in a state of war and living in fear of having their shit taken, which he says is something that only comes about once you have injustice.
Right. And then there is the one added element. There is that desire for self-preservation, but there's also the principle of empathy at work. That's pre-social.
Yeah.
Pre-reflective, it doesn't require reason. So those two principles, but I think he thinks, the instinct of self-preservation isn't going to lead to that many ills anyway.
Which I think it was good that we read this rather than the social contract, because I remember looking at the beginning of the social contract, and he starts by saying something like, serving your self-interest being primary, and sort of building on that. He's not talking anymore there about the state of nature. He's talking about sort of in society when we're just trying to figure out what government we're going to have, given that we're already in society.
How to make the best of a bad situation, which
yes,
it's not all clear that he thinks it's that bad in the social contract.
And then he thinks even for primitive people, pursuing your own survival is still the primary thing, but that's different than egoism. He wants to distinguish between self-respect and self-love. It was different in different translations. Of course, we do what we need to do to survive, but like Hobbes thinks that the only way to make sure you survive is to just grind everybody else down so low that they have no chance of taking your stuff. And he just thinks that that's completely foreign to this savage nature, to human nature itself. But, if you see somebody else get hurt, that's terrible. And that's something that Hobbes or all the folks that just say, oh, nobody's ever altruistic, everybody just is selfish, they don't seem to have recognition of.
I love the way he describes the fact that, not only do what he calls the brutes have empathy, do animals have empathy, but even like the most depraved human beings. And, he gives examples of, say, some Roman emperor who's indifferent to the slaughter of thousands of people, but you can go into a theater and see some sad story and cry at it. So even in these sort of depraved human beings who seem like they are completely lacking in empathy. In fact, the empathy is still there, and it's a certain social condition which deadens it in some situation.
Yeah, which I thought about that, like watching Schindler's List or something, and you ask, like, how could people treat people as horribly as the concentration camp guards treated their prisoners? Well, that's because they didn't see them as human anymore. They, really got themselves mind fucked so that they put these people in a certain category so that they weren't people, and they didn't have to empathize with them. And that's like something that they had to be conditioned into.
Yeah.
Is that as much time as it took to bring up a Nazi example?
It was a movie example. That's okay.
Jeez, no, I know.
It's okay to bring up Nazis as long as it's Nazi movies.
No, it's just...
I think it's okay to bring up Nazis in general.
You know how I feel about using that as a limit case example. All right, so a couple of things I kind of want to point out just to lay some groundwork here. When we talked about Hobbes in our previous episode, which our faithful listeners will know about, and for those of you who are listening to this for the first time, you can go back and listen to, Hobbes proposed this idea of the state of nature, which is prior to civilization. What is it like for people to live outside of civil society? And one of the things that's kind of unclear in his analysis, or at least to us it was, is whether he was actually saying that this is the way it was, or is this just a thought experiment to try and hypothesize about the nature of natural law and natural rights and how societies get formed and how societal or conventional rights can come on top of natural rights. One of the things that Rousseau does, which I think is very good, is that he says, I'm not going to let the facts actually intrude. I think he uses that turn of phrase. I will not let the facts intrude upon what I'm saying. He basically says this is purely hypothetical and speculative, and that I'm just sort of theorizing about what things are like. And it's a thought experiment in that respect. Now, two things about that. One is that he was much more aware, apparently, than Hobbes was about the behaviors of these so-called indigenous societies that obviously influenced his, let's just call it, naive views of people like the Caribs, right? We can call it his racist views about them, but he was doing this as a thought experiment.
Is it racist if they're favorable views? It's still racist, but he's like, they have good love lives, they relax, they're...
No, exactly. And It's naive and very sort of like
Really good
Eurocentric.
resorts.
Eurocentric, but at least he acknowledges that. Because I had a hard time when I was reading this. I was like, really? Are you really going to go there? Are you really going to say that? You're really going to defend that? But I'm trying to put it in context to understand that. So the other thing is that he romanticizes these so-called pre-civil society cultures. He says it early on in part 1 of the Discourse. The savage man is strong and not subject to illness, whereas civilized man is, weak and effeminate. Primitive man, the Aborigines of Australia, they don't have these problems, right? Because they're tough and strong and they don't get sick. They don't have the flu and they don't worry about bird flu and mad cow disease and all these other sorts of things. And I think that obviously contributed to this view of him as the pastoral romanticist. Which it's kind of also laying the foundation for what he's going to try to build off of, because he is going to try to build this story about how culturalization and the entering into civil society creates all these ills, including inequality. So it's important as a context, I think.
If I would just walk outside now and try to walk the dog for more than a minute and a half, then I feel like his whole picture of the savage as being happy with his lot is a load of crap, unless the savage does not live in an area with a lot of mosquitoes.
The savages naturally repelled mosquitoes more.
It's because their diet. That's right.
Because of their diet, their sweat was naturally anti-mosquito.
That having been said, Rousseau agrees with Hobbes and some of the other state of nature guys that the one fundamental principle, what you might call the one fundamental natural right that exists in the state of nature, is that of self-preservation. That's what I read out of that. Do you guys agree that that's what he's saying?
Well, he says 2 principles at some point, right? And then he says self-preservation and empathy.
He says we are born free as soon as we are old enough to care for ourselves. And this is sort of toward the end of the essay and in Social Contract, that we have the right and indeed the obligation, and this is very Kantian, and Kant was very influenced by him, that it is the essence of our humanity to be free, to be self-reliant in a certain way. That you cannot abrogate yourself of that right.
Self-reliance or self-preservation?
I think at different parts he's talking about different things. I didn't notice early on him actually referring to self-preservation as a right. Certainly it's one of the tendencies that we have.
You're right.
And Hobbes uses the word right about that. Hobbes used it in a really strange way, and we weren't really even sure what he was talking about. Because he also says, and this is the way Rousseau interprets him, that Hobbes says that we have the right to everything, right? We have to do whatever we think is necessary to preserve ourselves, which again, he thinks that the savage man, Hobbes thinks, will have to essentially kill everybody else to really secure that.
This part where he talks about empathy or compassion, he says there's another principle which has escaped Hobbes, which having been bestowed on mankind to moderate on certain occasions the impetuosity of egoism, or before its birth, the desire for self-preservation, is the repugnance at seeing a fellow creature suffer. I'm speaking of compassion. He talks about Hobbesian self-preservation, then he adds this principle of empathy.
I wanted to get around to that point about compassion, Wes, but I think there's a distinction here about this concept of preservation. He's not disagreeing with Hobbes that self-preservation is the principal activity of the individual in the state of nature. Self-preservation is kind of the principal goal of human activity. Mm-hmm. In the state of nature, whereas Hobbes said it's your right. Hobbes said self-preservation is a natural right, your natural right. And of course, since self-preservation includes protection from being impinged upon by all these other influences, you have a right to basically establish your dominion aggressively and violently as you see fit. Rousseau is saying there really is no such thing as right, or virtue and vice and those sorts of things. That it's simply the case that self-preservation is what people do in the state of nature, and that self-preservation is not a particularly aggressive activity. In the state of nature, it's pretty easy for people to just kind of do their own thing and get along, and they have no inclination to enforce their will upon others in order to preemptively secure their self-preservation as if it were a right. Where, in fact, the opposite, as Wes pointed out, that it's impossible not to feel compassion for others, even though your primary interest is self-preservation, you also have this inclination to compassion. More importantly, there are no rights, so to speak, in the sense that there's such a thing as a natural right, and that then there's a natural right for you to self-preserve. It's just simply an instinct. That right doesn't exist in the state.
Yeah, I think Rousseau and Hobbes are both inconsistent about this idea of, are there moral truths or the normative claims before society comes into the picture? Because Hobbes, on the one hand, uses the word right in the way you're saying, but then he also says, once the state is formed, the social compact is what grounds all further right, and in fact grounds the definition of right, so that the sovereign is the one who decides from then on what is right and wrong, right? He believes whatever the sovereign defines morality, essentially, is at least one interpretation of Hobbes, whereas Rousseau has a similar kind of thing, that most of our moral considerations and what we consider virtues and vices and things, all that comes up with society. Of course, those are socially created. But then in other places, he talks in the same way. We are born free. We are born with this right or duty of freedom, of duty to act out our humanity as free agents or something like that. So I'm not sure ultimately when you can use the word right.
That's true. That's ambiguous. What's not ambiguous is where he comes down about the concept of inequality. But
yeah,
I can agree with that.
Let's talk about that. So he does believe that there are natural inequalities. Some people run faster than others. Some people hunt better than others, whatever. But he thinks that once you get in society, not only do people notice those and start taking offense about those or whatever, but it also exacerbates them, so that if one savage is a little smarter than another, it's not that big a deal. They're not going to have that big an advantage. But then if you put them both in a public school system and one of them is not getting the hand-holding that he needs to excel, and the other one is bright enough that he can figure it out and work through it, then the intellectual difference between them magnifies greatly.
Or more importantly, if one of them is a much better public speaker and gains honor and recognition, where the other one doesn't.
Right. There are more opportunities for these natural things to play out into concrete power differentials.
Right.
And sometimes he does sound like a social Darwinist about that. Like, oh, well, at a certain stage, then the people who are the more industrious, then they're able to take advantage of that situation and put themselves on top.
But there is no on top in a state of nature, though, right?
No, I'm talking once you get into, once society is solidifying.
He does give his own little sort of account of how we get from complete state of nature into society. It might be worth just spending a little bit of time on that so that we don't lose the distinction.
Well, that's the whole second part, right?
Yeah, because he does have a very interesting idea where he thinks in the state of nature, human beings are very much like animals in the sense that males and females come together only to copulate and raise young. And when the young are old enough to move on, that they lose all interest, in each other and move on to the next thing, which is kind of, I thought that it was amusing.
Yeah, not probably based on the best science.
Well, yeah.
Given that, wolves mate for life, and, there are plenty of instances in nature that...
Yes, it was clearly not even informed by, I'm sure, what science and zoology was available even in the day, but I still thought it was kind of interesting. But it's important to him because he thinks that if you're talking about the state of nature related to an individual, where an individual is only doing what they can accomplish and confine themselves only to what they do themselves and is only concerned with their own self-preservation, this idea of the family unit is the first association of individuals into a collective. It is the basis, ultimately, for civil society because it's the first and only real natural association of individuals into a collective. Again, you can disagree with whether or not that's the case, but that's his view.
He really doesn't give a lot of room in his view for psychological dependence, does he? It all just comes down to, of course, kids that can't take care of themselves are going to be dependent on their parents, but even them, it's a matter of getting what they need to survive, not a matter of being personally attached to each other.
Well, he talks about the development of personal attachment.
The development.
Initially, it's survival, and then you get this, he calls it, quote-unquote, the expansion of the human heart, where you get conjugal love and you get parental affection, and that comes about as a result of proximity, where you're living in the same dwelling together.
Well, it's just interesting that in the state of nature, he doesn't think that slavery is possible, as opposed to, I guess I normally see Hegel's view, the master and slave view, as the subsequent historical development that improved on all these social contract guys, but yet it seems like Rousseau is saying something that might be an advance upon. Oversimplifying Hegel's view is that society starts when one guy bashes another guy over the head and sort of makes him his slave. that you get these tribes that are sort of strict tyrannies. Yeah, I don't know if Hegel says this could be.
You say Rousseau is saying that?
No, that's Hegel's view.
Oh.
Whereas Rousseau is saying that's not possible. In fact, if one person tries to take a slave, I mean, the slaver is going to have to go to sleep at some point, and then the slave just runs away. Whereas it seems like pack dogs, they're not all necessarily related. They're not all necessarily from the same litter, but some can dominate others, and it creates these social relations, non-linguistic social relations, where some are just perpetually cowed by others and seem to accept the subservient role.
I was reminded of Hegel, too, in the sense that, especially when I tried to boil it all down, this sort of critical point of self-awareness, right? He calls it reflection at some point, self-awareness and self-love, and then the awareness of that in others. So that's where you get the sort of Hegelian mutual recognition and the building up of the social. So at the same time that you get these social relations that are necessary to self-consciousness and essential to, who we are as human beings, you get this, I think, something corresponding to the life-death struggle between Hegel's master and slave. It's naturally adversarial because you're trying to win recognition from the other and you're engaged in this game, and that's where all the ills come from. The thing which seems to be most distinctively human, reason, and the source of all our, virtues for, say, someone like Aristotle, I think for Rousseau is the source of all our vices and all our problems.
I didn't read it quite the same way. I'm going to take leave of this little evolutionary act that he takes, which I thought was kind of interesting and probably in a lot of ways more realistic than what we saw in Hobbes, for example. But if, as Marx says, for Hegel, the beginning of society is when one guy bashes another guy over the head and makes him a slave, then for Rousseau, the beginning of society is when somebody stands on a piece of land and says, "This is mine." Property and the declaration of ownership of property is the foundation of civil society. Really what happens is when somebody figures out that you can mine ore and turn it into metal, or you can take a plot of land and cultivate it. So in other words, anything that you do, labor that you do now, which has no immediate gain, but is for future gain. So it's not hunting and gathering or fishing or whatever, that it's something different. Like that activity is the beginning of civil society because you have to be able to have the freedom and the space to do it. You have to have the time and the leisure and the protection of your own work that you put in. You have specialized labor, particularly in like mining, for example, metallurgy and agriculture.
Right. But Seth, that actually, in the second part, property, even though he begins by saying the famous line where the first person to enclose a piece of ground is the real founder of civil society, he then goes back and gives that whole tracing of going from the state of nature to civil society, and property actually comes about a little later. And so you do get the whole self-awareness thing before property. Because the first instances of property are the hut for enclosing your family, and then the land for tilling and cattle. Those don't come about until people are actually in little proto-societies. Because one of the reasons why agriculture comes about, for instance, is because if you have some people working on metallurgy, which is necessary to other arts, not everyone is going to be able to contribute to the subsistence within this little hunter-gatherer group. So you already have a proto-social group. But for that to even begin, for there even to be property, you have to have what he calls reflection or self-awareness.
Yeah, no, I get what you're talking about. I mean, in fact, what he says is housing is the first notion of property. So if you go from being the solitary hunter-gatherer to copulating with a member of the opposite sex in order to bear children, presumably at some point it was just simply copulation, and the females were required to, who knows what the mating rituals and patterns were for Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. I don't know, and I don't really want to get into it. But at some point, the male takes it upon himself to build a hut because the female is going to have to give birth and then tend to the young. And that's really the very first inkling of property, the very first inkling of the division of labor from this hunter-gatherer concept. But it also introduces the idea of, oh, well, look, I don't have to do this by myself. There are other couples, there are other groups of individuals who are all going to be doing the same activity, and we should all get together and put our huts pretty close together. Still my hut, but I can walk over to Bob's hut or Jane's hut or whatever, and we'll all just have huts near each other. And he says, therewith comes leisure.
Yeah.
Which we then use to furnish ourselves with conveniences, which, presumably, which he says are the source of many ills. So, of course, singing and dancing, playing the flute and drums, all that stuff, that's what we do to fill the time, like presumably because now we built these houses and now we aren't out hunting and walking and gathering all the time. And of course, some people are better singers and some people are better dancers than others. And then you're going to get jealousy and recognition and honor, which is going to introduce all this idea. First step towards inequality and vice. So I don't know if we can disentangle the concept of property and leisure. His idea is simply that once you get beyond sustenance living, which is to say being an animal, once you get beyond that and you have time to sit around and think about stuff and come up with time wasters and all that, and think that something might belong to you, that's kind of the introduction of all of the ills of society and ultimately equality. Yeah.
Once you can come up with Sudoku, that...
But I'm still at the beginning of the second part where he's tracing all of this. I find it hard to get. I had to reread that a few times, the first 2 or 3 pages. How do we get to the social part? That's really what I wanted to figure out, right? Granted that once we become social and once the recognition of others becomes important to us, then we're in for some problems. But I wanted to see how he got from the state of nature to that social part. And it's a really odd account because it starts out with him talking about self-preservation and then competition for survival with other animals. And he talks about population increase. He talks about, I don't know if you remember this, the demands of different seasons, different geographies. And then he gets to this point where he talks about, quote unquote, relevance of all these things to himself, of all these various beings, of all these contingencies and the perceptions of the relations between them and between himself and them, and the fact that he's stronger than animals, which seems to be, oddly enough, that first level of reflection is man's concept, and this is very biblical, but is man's conception of his dominance over the animals. And then he talks about, I don't know if you remember this, but the setting of traps for them and what he calls tricks, and the quote-unquote first emotion of pride, which is over animals. And that I found to be a really interesting way to try and get us to be social, because then the next step there is that pride and dominance. Then he looks at others and so here's a quote, inferred that their manner of thinking and acting was altogether in conformity with his own, specifically that they also had this awareness. They also felt this pride. And if we go back to the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche calls this pathos of, quote unquote, pathos of distance. This sense of power, the sense of superiority. I just thought that was very interesting as sort of the attempt at a Big Bang theory for going from this asocial state to the social state.
Well, he starts off, after talking about just man as an animal running around by himself. Before we get at property, you can't say property is, the mark of the beginning of situation, because the conception of property requires so much. And he has that section on language that really kind of goes nowhere, and he concludes that he has no freaking idea because he thinks.
And then he comes back to language later on again.
Right, so. But he says you couldn't really have language worked out without already having society. Yet you couldn't have society without having language. So I thought that was an interesting little dead end there. But he's at least trying. He's trying to be, even though he's just a terrible anthropologist, he's trying to go back to the beginning, far before Hobbes or any of these folks were considering, and see how from the ground up a human could be built. It's interesting exercise.
He's not going to let the facts get in the way. I mean, he's just, like he says, who knows? We're just speculating. He's just trying to tell a story. But he, ultimately thinks he's going to get to some very important principles, I guess, at some point.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the Cartesian social meditation, right? What do we try and like do a thought experiment where you strip human beings of all their social elements. So I think that's cool.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I think we've touched on a couple points. Let me throw them together. His conception is that the quote unquote state of nature involves the solitary individual, and that solitary individual is concerned with self-preservation, but not aggressive and violent and trying to aggressively sort of step out and defend in the same way that Hobbes says. In fact, the individual has compassion for others in this state of nature. In some way, whether it's through property, familial associations, or pride over tricking animals, there's this introduction of concepts of association or relations with other individuals that gets started. And that's really the point he wants to try to make, is that there is a point at which we find a need to associate with other individuals. And it's really in the association with others that's the genesis for all of the good of civil society and all of the ill that constitutes civil society, which is ultimately the purpose of this essay, which is inequality. Where does it come from?
Yeah.
It comes from the association with others and the sorts of activities that come out of that.
But it's mostly ill, by the way.
Yes.
He parenthetically puts, meaning a few good things and a lot of bad things.
Yes.
Sure. And so,
I thought that was funny.
Well, and one of the things that I thought was interesting with respect to Wes's point about industry is that I'm pretty sure he lays out the labor theory of value.
Yes, I was going to say that in the state of nature, things are abundant. And you might get in a conflict with somebody over some meat, but really, if you lose the conflict, it doesn't become personal. You don't try to get revenge. You just go find some other meat. There's plenty of meat lying around.
Well, he talks about the idea of mixing your labor with, like, in cultivation, specifically in agriculture, that the first...
That's the only way something can become property.
The only way something can become property, or at least one of the principles that's required, is that you mix your labor with the land to cultivate it. And I was very curious about this, and, he lived near Hume for that period of time, and Adam Smith was a contemporary of the two of them, and also in Scotland at the time. But Discourse on Inequality was written in 1754, and Wealth of Nations was not written until 1776. I think it's interesting because he may very well, maybe one of the criticisms in the Wikipedia entry is that Rousseau wasn't an original thinker. He used a lot of other people's ideas, but he put them together in kind of interesting ways. So I was curious if this was his idea or somebody else's, but it definitely is there.
Well, the three of them were actually, they had a podcast for a while, and then Rousseau stole
That would have been pretty badass.
That's a good point. That's interesting. Yeah, who came up with it first? Yeah. And then Marx, of course, was all over Rousseau, right?
Yes, very much so.
There's an interesting thing in the stages of civilization here that he actually feels like it's not just that once you start hanging around people that things get mostly bad, that when it's in its really early state, when, we have these impromptu joinings for mutual interest, right? Hunting together, and you don't need much language, but you get rudimentary language, you get some tool use, things get a little easier, you get these shelters and the families living under one roof, difference between hunting and gathering, these other things with sexes, with the singing and dancing, that he actually thinks this is mostly a good stage, that things don't... Yeah. He says, here's a quote, though men had become less patient and their natural compassion had already suffered some diminution, this period of expansion of the human faculties, keeping a just mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our egoism, must have been the happiest and most stable of epochs. So I thought that was interesting. And this is what he thinks like the Caribbean folks are still more or less at. So there is some like, ooh, you're a better dancer than me. And, there's vanity and envy and things, so there's some negative stuff in it, but it doesn't yet overwhelm. It doesn't make everybody an enemy of everybody else. It's only when we really start to mutually depend on each other. It's not the mutual association it's the mutual dependence for our very lives.
Right. Yeah. He calls that the mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of our egoism. Which I thought to be cool. But yeah, that was interesting because what he had described up to that point sounded pretty bad to me. And then he sort of says, but this was actually the golden mean. This was sort of the best combination of humanity and the pre-social or pre-human.
It's interesting that the noble savage concept, which is what, the chief phrase that I hear associated with Rousseau, really isn't anywhere in here. That the indolence of the primitive state, like those primitives are not the noble savages. Like maybe these guys that he's talking about are at this early stage of civilization are the noble savages, but they're not savage according to what he was saying. So it doesn't sound like that's his
Well, I'm not
phrase.
sure that he thinks indolence is such a bad thing, or even that even though you get all this evil stuff, you get all the higher human qualities, like appreciation of beauty, for instance, that comes about once we leave the state of nature. But he didn't say much about the positive side, right?
You think philosophy would be in there, but yet when he
He
explicitly
only
brings
talks
it up,
about it contemptuously.
yes. Well, what are you doing, dude?
It's for how our empathy can leave us. Yeah. The philosopher puts his fingers in his ears and says la 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 to not hear the suffering of those outside his room or something like that. That surprised me when he brought it up to the Caribs and said, this is where it's at. And then from there it gets really bad. But that's still pre-agriculture, right? That's still hunter-gatherer.
Yes, that's right. Like you're saying, the agricultural and metalworking is when people become seriously dependent on each other, when slavery becomes actually possible.
There's that great phrase, slavery and misery were soon seen to germinate and grow up with the crops. I thought that was a great image.
So once this gets really developed, then you get serious competition and everybody really becomes the potential enemy of everybody else. And this is what he thinks corresponds to what Hume must have been talking about when he was saying state of nature. It's really quite an advanced stage of civilization. And at this point, the ones who have acquired the most property, who have parlayed their natural skill in organizing people or working hard or whatever to their advantage so that they have more than others. And they're the ones that have something to lose then, like all this chaos that's going on around them and everybody resenting each other and taking violent actions against each other. So they're the ones that propose, for our mutual safety, we have to accept this social contract, which in fact then just solidifies their material superiority over the others.
Right. How does he put that? He has a great way of...
Like dupes are easy to find or something?
Well, he talks about it's like the greatest sham or something that anyone put over...
I see. To this end, after having shown his neighbors the horror of a situation which aimed them against each other, which made their possessions as burdensome as their needs, and in which no one found safety either in poverty or wealth, he easily invented plausible reasons for leading them to his goal. Let us unite, he said to them, to protect the weak from oppression, to restrain the ambitious, and to assure each person of the possession of what belongs to him. Let us institute rules of justice and peace, to which all are obligated to conform, that favor no one in particular, and that in some way make amends for the caprices of fortune by subjecting equally the powerful and the weak to mutual duties. In the next paragraph, far fewer words than these were needed to win over crude, easily seduced men who had furthermore too many difficulties to clear up among themselves to be able to do without arbitrators, and too much avarice and ambition to be able to do without masters for long.
Yeah.
All ran headlong into their chains, hoping to ensure their liberty.
Yeah.
So there's the social contract. So whereas Hobbes makes that the current foundation, like why you should obey the sovereign, because you have implicitly agreed to this social contract, Rousseau is going to keep that language, but say we are suckered into this social contract. And certainly this isn't anything that you could pass on to your descendants, that they would have to renew it constantly. This is something in the social contract essay, he says.
The thing I wanted to quote, which doesn't sound that great now, but the rich man, thus urged by necessity, conceived at length the profoundest plan that ever entered the mind of man. Which is to convince the weak that we can institute justice for all. Which is sort of, that's the opposite of Nietzsche's take on it, right? Where the weak are the ones who establish morality for their own benefit.
They establish morality for their own benefit as a reaction to the strong having already established their own morality, right? Which excludes them. So that's not really their own ethics.
It's not a morality for the strong. It's just
their code of virtue.
The strong dominate the weak, and then the slave morality comes about as a way to say certain things are evil and certain things should be punished. And so here, I think the ideology emanates from and this is kind of what Marx will say too, it's the rich who come up with all of this stuff to bamboozle the poor, or the strong to bamboozle the weak. And for Nietzsche, it's the weak who are using ideology to get one over on the strong, people who would otherwise simply dominate. No?
Right, because Rousseau says that and this is again from the social contract essay, where he says something like, right from might doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, he's arguing against, apparently, there must have been some prevalent theories at the time about the right of conquest, or the right of the powerful, the right of strength. And he says the conquest of the powerful or the association of the weak can't really be the origin of political society. This is in order to, it's a counter argument against, like other theories. And he says, a right of conquest isn't a right. It can't found other rights. Vanquishers and vanquished remain at war. Violence cannot be the founding principle of any real society because there's no right involved. Simply, just like you said earlier, Mark, as soon as you go to sleep, somebody's going to rise up and kill you, or as soon as they become strong enough, they'll kill you. And It's the same thing about the association of the people who are being oppressed. All they're doing is exerting the desire for self-preservation. And if they aren't strong enough to do it now, when they get strong enough, they will. There's no rights involved.
Right. If you said might makes right, then yes, it would be right for the strong to be oppressing the weak. But then as soon as the weak rise up and smash down the strong, well, that's right for them to do too. So there's no moral upshot at all.
No, and you may be the strongest one today, but there may be somebody else stronger that comes tomorrow, and suddenly they're now the right ones.
He does say, he says, all natural right is derived from two principles. And then he says that does the compassion, self-preservation thing. So I think he agrees with Hobbes that natural right is derived from self-preservation. It's just that self-preservation doesn't really involve domination, because there is no such thing as domination before you get to the social part of things. So it's not like the social can be derived from relations of domination and conquest and all that stuff, because that doesn't even come about until the social, right? So to say it's right of conquest gets it exactly backwards. There's no such thing as conquest until we're in a social state. So for Hobbes, it would be a right because there's, like Mark said, we have a right to everything for Hobbes in the state of nature. It's might makes right. Rousseau, there is no might makes right because that's not the way self-preservation works. Someone takes your tree, you go to the next tree.
Yep. And he has a couple of other comments there, but one of the things that I thought he said that was interesting too is that right of conquest isn't a right. Strong and weak, as used in these theories, are really ambiguous, but they boil down to rich and poor. And he says, and really when it comes down to it, the poor really only have their liberty, and it would be the most absurd thing for them to hand it over to somebody else in exchange for nothing. He's trying to disassemble the idea of the master-slave, that people would voluntarily enter into power relations with others as the subordinate or the oppressed in order to be quote-unquote protected or secure or whatever. It's like, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
If you're in that relation, it's because you're not strong enough to be out of it. And if you get strong enough to be out of it, you will get out of it. And that's all there is to it.
Well, the concepts of protection and security require concepts of property and mutual dependence, right? Because otherwise you could just flee. It's only after you've sort of, all the land has been taken up and things have become a zero-sum game and there's all this property that
your family can be held hostage.
Yeah, or domination even makes sense because until you're dependent on someone, they can't dominate you. Well, again, move to the next tree. It's when there are no next trees to move to that you're in trouble. So it doesn't make sense that someone in a state of nature where they have all those options would say, oh yeah, I'm going to just give up my liberty now, even though I have no property. No, there has to be property first. There has to be all of that stuff first. So it's not like property, again, like Hobbes, I think, and Locke try and derive property from the social compact, when in fact Rousseau is saying, no, property is required even for that to come about.
And I'm trying to think of which movie this is a quote from. You know why he's so dangerous? Because he has nothing left to lose.
In a world.
We jumped a little to the, once this original pact was made, that's sort of where the discourse more or less wraps up. And then the social contract kind of is the first place where he gives some sort of positive, well, how could a society actually be legitimate? Whereas in this one, he seems to say, the society is inherently illegitimate. And I just found a quote here flipping through his works, which actually is from a different work, Discourse on Political Economy, which says, let us summarize in a few words the social pact between the two estates. Right, the rich and the poor. You need me, for I am rich and you are poor. Let us make an agreement between us. I shall permit you to have the honor of serving me on the condition that you give me what little you have left. In return for the trouble I shall be taking to command you.
That's great.
He's a snarky bastard.
Power to the people, baby. Yeah, that's why I like this essay better than Social Contract, where basically, social contract, you're no longer in the sort of adolescent fuck society phase. That's when you've reached your 30s and you have a family and you just say, all right, I used to be a hippie, but now I have to, get a job and make a living and just accept things and figure out how to make it work.